Fora TV. The world is thinking.
Perhaps the most interesting, and that was the third thing that we found and broadcast as part of our interim report, is the strong link between biodiversity and poverty. The typical view that is taken is that somehow it's a choice. You can either have biodiversity or you can have a solution to poverty. You can either have development, you can have nature. You can't have both. And that's a false thinking. It is not the case that biodiversity is just the preserve of the rich. It's valuable to everyone, but it is an absolute necessity for the poor. And the poor gravitate towards biodiversity-rich regions not because they're mad or because they're poor, because they get so much free that is where it's best to live. We worked this out in economic terms like this, said that, okay, what if the forests were lost? Yep, there would be an impact of, depending on where you are, whether it's Brazil or whether it's, if it's Brazil, you probably have an impact of about 10% of GDP if you lost all ecosystem services. In India, 16%, in Indonesia, 21%. Sounds big, but nothing particularly fussed because we're not losing all the forests. This is about a total value being lost. But if you ask the question differently, saying, who suffers if you lose the forest? All right, so what do the forests provide? Flood prevention and drought control. Who suffers if the forests are lost? The poor farmer. What else do they provide? Oh, they provide nutrients and fresh water, which go from the forest into the fields, and therefore provide the poor farmer, guess what, with his livelihood. The subsistence farmer, once again. Who suffers if cattle can't go into the forest and feed on leaf litter? Oh, it's the poor farmer. Who suffers if they can't harvest bamboo and fuel wood from the forest? Oh, guess what? The poor farmer, once again. So when we looked at to whom did the benefits flow that we are talking about, it was all to the poor farmer or to the poor tribal. So we recalculated our numbers and said, all right, let's find out not what are ecosystem services as a percentage of GDP, but let's find out what are ecosystem services as a percentage of the GDP of the poor. Then we got to some rather more different numbers, because then the answers were 75% in the case of Indonesia, 47% India, 89% for the Brazilian tribals and forest dependents. That's the point. That if you lose these forests, if you lose nature, you are actually making the poor poorer. You are actually hurting their livelihoods. And I think this is probably the first time that the economics of this was presented. I mean, this is something that was known to people who are in the field of environmental management, but the economics of this was presented, and I believe it did make a difference in terms of bringing to attention to policymakers, especially in the development agendas, what is the meaning of ecological infrastructure? Why is it important? Why do we have to worry about nature? Why must we value nature?